Welcome to Geek Warning, the podcast that puts the world's most interesting cycling tech and more into one place. This week, we are going to talk a lot about Strava's most recent updates and about a lot of new bikes. My name is Suvi, and I am joined with a full crew again. I have Dave Rome here. How are you doing, Dave?
Hey, Suvi.
And Brad Copeland is with us as well.
Hey, everyone. It's good to be back with you, of course.
Good to have you, Brad. And lastly, but not least, we have Ronan McLaughlin.
Hi, Suvi. I'm good. Thanks.
That's good. And in addition to our regular crew, we also have a special guest on this week. Because, like I mentioned, Strava has been in the headlines a lot. And we're going to talk about the newest confusion that it has caused with the API updates. Ronan, so Strava has caused a lot of confusion this week. What's been happening there?
Yes, Suvi, Strava has sparked some panic this week with sweeping changes to how third-party apps can use its API. That's the application programming interface. Strava said these updates are for enhanced user privacy and data control, but they have left many developers and users frustrated with claims that the restrictions could cripple popular coaching and analytics apps. I'm reading this because today, joining us, we have RainMaker of DCRainMaker, who's been closely covering this development. Actually, kind of broke this news. We all got this email into our inbox on Monday evening, I think. Most of us didn't open it because we get far too many emails these days, but Ray did open it. And Ray, can you maybe tell us what the heck's going on here?
Yeah, essentially on, I think it was Tuesday sometime, Strava notified all their users, at least users that had some sort of app connected to their account, which is a lot of people because, in some way, shape, or form, most of us have a Strava app or some third-party app connected to our Strava account, whether it's feeding data into Strava, like coming from Garmin or Wahoo or whatever the case is, or it's data going out of Strava to any number of other platforms. That could be something like TrainerRoad or Exert or Wanderer. There's literally like 30,000 Strava apps out there, according to the company. So they're saying tens of thousands, and last time they gave a number was like 6-7 years ago, and I think it was 20,000. So I'm sure we're talking 30 to 40,000 apps. And a lot of those apps are very small hobbyist things, but there's also a lot of apps that are huge things that have potentially millions of users on them. So with this email, they basically kind of said, hey, some stuff's changing. Go click this page to go find out more. When you click the page, you found out there was basically three kind of changes that were being made. And the first one is that apps could no longer show you or the apps themselves could no longer show your data to other people. So meaning that you send your ride or whatever over to this third-party app, something like VeloViewer. And on that app, they may have a segment leaderboard, a curated set of leaderboards, or another one called like 100 Climbs, which shows the top 100 climbs in various countries and across Europe. And you can see where you are on these leaderboards quickly, or maybe they show you on a heat map in the case of VeloViewer as well. And so Strava is saying that they can't do that anymore. So that breaks a lot of those type of scenarios, but it also breaks coaching apps. So companies like Final Surge, for example, and Exert will pull in data from Strava, and any of those apps are not allowed to show data to another user. Even if you've authorized that user, it doesn't matter. It's only you as the individual, and that's it. So that was kind of change part like 1 and 1.5 or so. And then the second change was that they restricted basically any AI usage whatsoever from third-party apps. So that means that any third-party apps that have data flowing into them are not allowed to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, or quote, similar, without any definition of what similar actually is, in their apps, in basically the data coming from Strava. Now, of course, while AI has had a lot of attention over the last few years, and there's lots of fear mongering around that and all that, something like machine learning has been used for a decade now or so. It's hardly new. It's hardly cutting edge, but kind of Strava lumped all these things in there as well. So those are sort of the big bits there. And then the last piece was that they expanded one section of their terms, which talks about analysis of data. And so in particular, they said that, apps can no longer do anything that mirrors Strava at all, which they've always had that to some degree, but they've kind of clarified this section more, saying that you can't do any aggregated or de-identified manner, including analytics, analysis, customer insights generation, and products or services improvements. So that one paragraph, as one company said to me, once you can't do any analysis, that means you can't tell a user how many miles they rode that week. You can't tell them if they were faster this week versus last week. It's just a very nebulous, section there. And that's the challenge with a lot of this stuff, is that it's just somewhat nebulous, but also somewhat very, very broad. And so apps have rightfully kind of freaked out because this kills off a lot of apps and a lot of big name apps as well.
I guess the first question is this effective already, or when does this come into force?
So Strava notified apps last Friday night, following the footsteps of many organizations sending out bad news on a Friday night. And a lot of apps didn't seem to kind of realize it at first until the users started asking on Tuesday when it went out to consumers. And so they gave those apps 30 days notice. Otherwise, the connections would be severed. Keeping in mind, 30 days over, at least in the US anyways, the holiday period and going into holidays, just across a lot of places, is a tough time frame, especially as a lot of apps will put in place basically code freezes around the holidays to prevent issues where you have, employees out on vacation or things like that could fix issues. So you tend to see a lot of tech companies put in place code freezes around now. And so now you're asking all these companies to not only make a change, but make potentially a sweeping change to their application and how they deal with data.
A change, but what I'm hearing is that some apps will just be pointless if the wording we're seeing here is implemented.
Yep, totally. Yeah. So I think you look at an app like a Final Surge, for example, is a good example of that, where they're a coaching platform, somewhat similar to Training Peaks in a way. And so you have athletes that, there are certain athletes that may just use Final Surge as a way to have their training log and analysis and the data for themselves. So in that case, Final Surge will continue to work perfectly fine for those athletes. But there's also a lot of athletes on Final Surge that are going to have coaches. And so in those scenarios, those coaches won't be able to see the athlete's data. And it's even worse than that, because according to the Strava terms, Final Surge has to then delete all the data that came from Strava in the first place for those athletes, right? If they were to go ahead and disconnect that, or once this change is made, all the historical data for that athlete is also hidden from the coach. In the case of Final Surge, they've got these contingency plans. So they're going to go ahead and make more direct connections to companies like Garmin, which they already have. But, they have already a direct connection to Apple and so on. They're working on one, I believe, to Zwift. But the reality is that a lot of companies have used Strava as that middleman, because Strava's really promoted that for the last decade plus as being that, the Switzerland of data, if you will. So, everything will feed to Strava. And I think probably one of the best examples of that is actually this watch I'm testing right now. It's a Amazfit watch. Amazfit is a brand that is breaking into the US and in Europe, but is incredibly popular in Asia. And by and large, the data just uploads to Strava, and that's kind of it. Like, they don't have partnerships to Trainer Road or all these different Final Surge, etc. But that was all right, because you got your data to Strava, and then you just spit it out to whatever platform you actually wanted to use. And that's even the same with something like Google. If you have a Google Pixel watch, it uploads to Strava, but it doesn't go to plenty of other platforms natively. You have to get it there somehow, and Strava is really the most logical way to do that.
How likely is it then that the full wording of this will be implemented? Is it like some UCI rule where it'll be there but won't really be implemented? Or what's your take on how that's going to go?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces. Some of it, for example, around the AI bits, is something that takes a human to look at that and say, oh, you're doing AI, thus we are going to, cut you off because you violated the terms and conditions. And then some bits, they can start to do a little bit more in-house, but a lot of this does require a human evaluate that app and decide if they violate it. For example, if you're violating showing data to other users, right? That requires someone logging in and looking at the data and saying, oh, that data is visible to other users, publicly or privately. It's not just you. And it seems like Strava's done some of that, because some of the apps received wording in their notices that basically says, we've identified you as an app that is going to have to make changes because of this, right? Versus other apps just kind of got more generic stuff. So, how they decided what to send out where remains a mystery, right? Maybe they went through the top X number of apps, or maybe they're just the most popular apps. I don't really know. But, at the end of the day, for the big ticket apps, Strava knows who those are, right? They know who Trainer Road is and VeloViewer and all the other companies, because they've promoted them. That's the kicker.
Right. I kind of see Strava as like the whale in a symbiotic relationship with these apps, kind of being like the barnacles attached to the whale. Yep. The barnacles are getting a lot, but Strava isn't really necessarily benefiting from the relationship, but perhaps it isn't hurting it. I mean, what is Strava's play here? What's the reason that this is all coming about? What do you think is the catalyst for this?
I think a couple different things. I think one, I mean, there is certainly legitimate concern around people that have connected to a third-party app and may not understand that that app is broadcasting their data elsewhere. So, for example, I'm not picking on VeloViewer or something like that, but a case where someone connects it to VeloViewer and doesn't really think about it, and all the data goes there, and then now that data is public in a heat zone map or something else. And as we've learned over the last a lot of years, there are cases where people are, putting runs and rides and stuff like that in very sensitive locations online and not realizing the implications of that. And while Strava themselves, and I will give them plenty of credit, has done a lot of good around their privacy controls, some of those controls do fall apart once they get to a third-party platform. And Strava isn't, wrong about that. I think it's how Strava's implementing this seems to be a very broad brush there, seems to be a bit reactive. Some might argue it's, somewhat reactive to some of the stories in the last month or so that Le Monde publication in France published around President Biden and I think Prime Minister of France and a few other world leaders, where those locations were exposed because members of their advanced teams were doing runs from the hotels, and they could figure out which hotels the presidents were going to be staying at based on the runs from these advanced security teams, right? And thus they've had to change hotels at the last second and so on. But again, that's not really Strava's fault. That's Government Security 101, and literally the classes these people take outline the risks of doing this kind of stuff. And obviously they thought in some cases, hey, I'm just running in the middle of a random city in Europe, right? I'm running in, in Paris or Rome or whatever it may be. It's not a big deal. Again, the internet's sometimes, it's like the whole the internet cat thing, right? The internet finds all sorts of creative ways to take advantage of data.
So it's not necessarily like a improve their competitive position that you foresee it as. It is much more a data privacy issue.
I think the first part of it. I think the second piece with AI is definitely more of a competitive angle, right? Okay. I think Strava is looking at that. Obviously, they've dipped their toe into AI. If you've been on Strava, you know that you're getting these little AI insights that I think we all generally agree are almost entirely enthusiastically useless, right? But eventually Strava will get that right. I don't think there's any real question about that long term. I mean, right now, not so much, but eventually down the road. And I suspect their concern is that as this data starts going off to these other platforms, that is effectively minimizing their Strava's own, basically way to upsell you on potential AI coaching features or AI whatever down the road. Of course, it's silly to try to restrict those platforms from using AI or machine learning even, or whatever the generic similar word means, because that's just the internet as it's been for the last decade. So I think, in some ways, Strava should be focusing on how can they improve their value prop to the users today, as opposed to how can we reduce connections, for the users.
It seems to me like there would have been an opportunity in just like making that pushing your data out only available to premium Strava subscribers, and that would then be like a reason to be a Strava subscriber. Is there anything they could have done on the privacy end different to what the sort of nuclear option they've taken here?
Definitely. They could have done a lot of things around actual additional controls. We've seen that from other API players in the space. Garmin has a lot more control, a lot more granularity that you as an end user can control. And even some of that can be a blend of both, toggles as well as kind of traditional enforcement. For example, you could, if they're concerned about AI being a privacy thing, which is what Strava has couched it as, they say, these third-party apps may not have the same rigorous whatevers that Strava has internally, and thus we're trying to protect our users. Well, if that was the case, they could have added a toggle to the API, and then the third-party app would have had to either consent or not consent to that on behalf of the user, right? There's plenty of things that you can do there. And again, in the case of Strava, they themselves don't even have a toggle within Strava to be able to disable AI features beyond. You can leave the beta for the AI little pop-up thing, but in terms of Strava training against your data set within AI, there's no way you can opt out of that today, at least that they've made public. So it's a bit of a hypocritical stance for them to make. And I think for some of those other things, they can certainly, again, add toggles, add more privacy features. Strava has added a ton of privacy toggles over the last 5 or 6 years. One or two more wouldn't go astray.
Yeah, I didn't realize you could opt out of the AI beta analysis thing. I'm going to be opting out of that now as soon as we finish this call. Is there, just to wrap it up, is there any, should Strava be sort of careful what you wish for, sort of considering how much they rely on other industry players to get data sent to them?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, I mean, I've received a note from a lot of industry players, some of the biggest out there over the last few days. They're all watching this carefully. And it's easy for people to say, well, it's Strava's data. Well, one, it's not Strava's data, but it's easy to say, hey, it's Strava's app. They can do what they want with the data, et cetera. Setting aside that it's actually your data that you're uploading. And even like if you're in Europe, GDPR makes that very, very clear that Strava is merely a custodian of your data. They are not the owners of your data. But ultimately, Strava's success is because people are uploading data to their platform, right? At large, whether it's a free user or a paid user, they use that data to go ahead and basically increase popularity routing so they have the best routes possible, whether that's coming from a free user or coming from a paid user. They use that data for leaderboards. They use that data for the segments themselves. Like, I mean, there's just literally a million different ways that Strava leverages that data from both a free and a paid user. And as with any social network, as Strava self-identifies as a social network for athletes, if you start to lose people, then you lose your appeal. So I think there's a careful balance to walk there. Does it affect a lot of people day to day today? No, right? I think, if you're going to go on and just look at leaderboards and create a route, then no, it's not going to affect you today. But if, over time, enough people start going, yeah, I don't really have a reason to be here, then you start to lose the benefit of all those people and all those weird places that all of us in this call tend to ride, where every extra person helps sometimes when you're talking a weird trail that there's not a lot of data on.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been spending most of today thinking about my Strava account and the third-party apps I use, and it's definitely a more difficult sell to me, that Strava monthly or annual premium, if I don't have access. I enjoy those third-party apps more so than I enjoy Strava, if I'm really honest about it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people like that. It just depends on what you use. Like, I've connected obviously many apps over the years, and Wanderer, Earth, or whatever they call themselves, a good one. It's just fun, right? You connect the data, you pull it in, and I think they are an example of one that should largely be fine with this current AI cut, in terms of just seeing my own data and where I am on the planet. And obviously, I've used VeloViewer for a long time, and I think they are probably in a more precarious position on some of their features. Some will be fine, some of them won't, but yeah, I think a lot of people depend and certainly leverage those apps a lot. And I know Strava kind of mentioned in their update statement, they said only 0.1% of apps are affected, right? And I've seen a lot of media misunderstand that and say 0.1% users, right? And that's not at all the same thing, because if you have 0.1% of apps and you have, let's say, 30,000 plus apps, and the vast majority of those are hobbyist apps where someone connected to the API for a couple nights playing in, at home, and then has like 5 users or even just 1 user and then gave up on it, right? But there's also a bunch of apps that are big ticket apps with a million users or whatever the case is. And if you look at that 30,000, 0.1% of that is what, 300 or something like that. So it's a lot of big ticket apps that could be affected there.
Well, no doubt we'll be tracking and this one for a bit yet. I think we're all dreading what may or may not happen in 30 days from now. So we may or may not have you back on the podcast then.
Yeah, I think we should start. I think we'll probably start hearing, based on all these apps saying they have meetings with Strava over the next week or so. A lot of the apps have kind of, obviously the user bases are very concerned, and so these apps have tried to say, hey, we're talking with Strava, and most of them have actually announced when they have their meetings with Strava to find out how bad this will be. And so Strava's been meeting with many of the big apps out there and scheduling these meetings over the next week or so. And kind of like a little bit like manager meetings, right? You've got your meeting with your year-end meeting with your manager. And as I said somewhere else, ultimately, like, Strava wouldn't be scheduling these meetings with the development teams of Strava and these apps if it wasn't a big deal. If it was just a minor code tweak like they do all the time, they just would have sent an email. So this is certainly going to be substantial. We just don't know yet how bad it's really going to be for these apps.
Is this something, doing this after they've already made the announcement and made the changes, is this something that would happen in the tech development world often, that a platform like Strava makes this kind of announcement and then afterwards only actually arranges these meetings to tell the affected parties that this is what we are doing?
It depends on the company. Some companies will be, much more open with their biggest developers. I think probably the biggest surprise, like Trainer Road CEO Nate Pearson was very clear on the forums, and they're obviously one of the big players here. Same with Final Surge, saying they had absolutely no notice of this whatsoever until they received the email, just like everyone else. And so that's a bit telling, whereas most companies, if you're talking the biggest platforms, obviously Strava's not going to meet with every single little app out there, especially if there's 30,000 of them, but I would have certainly expected that the likes of Trainer and Final Surge and Exert and these other big platforms would have had a heads up on this. Like, that would have been completely normal, and had some plan in place so that the day of this announcement, you're not seeing posts coming from people like Nate, the CEO of a company, saying, this is the first we've ever heard of it, and our only option at this point seems to be to abandon ship, right? That's essentially what he said. And so that's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, well, Ray, I'm sure it's not the 99.9% of apps that Strava are setting up those meetings with. It's more likely the 0.1% that, could be a lot of tough meetings this week and next. So thank you for your time tonight, and we'll actually just tell folks where they can find the article and the video that you had sort of broke this news.
Yeah, no problem. Again, thanks for having me on. You can find the article at DCRainMaker.com or on YouTube at DCRainMaker. One of those two places will get you to the right spot there. Thanks again for having me on, though. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, that was for anybody who's been living under a rock and doesn't know DCRainMaker.com. So. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thanks.
So over in the UK, in London, actually, over the weekend, Suvi, you attended the Rouleur bike show. And yeah, I mean, what can you tell us about it? What was it like? How many people did you see? How many brands were there?
That's a good question. I did not count either of those.
Oh,
it's a very, as any cycling shows, I feel it's a very hectic experience. But I did not calculate any of the bikes or. Yeah, I
can't believe you didn't stand and count how many people were coming in.
I did
always
not.
Take your ticket counter with you. Stand at the door.
I should have done that.
Mm-hmm.
What I do know, though, it was sold out. It runs 3 days, and I think it was 2 of the days at least were sold out. No, it runs 3 days. So it was very, very busy. I think every year it feels really, really busy. This year especially. So
set the scene for us, for those that don't know Rouleur. Like, what sort of bicycling is it, and what are the sort of brands that you'd normally see in this show?
I'd say Rouleur is kind of on the upper end of the kind of cycling. The Rouleur Live is usually it's a home for like a lot of pling bikes that you will dream about. There were a lot of brands presenting that have bikes that cost south of kind of £15,000. So it's
mid-range.
It's really premium. Mid-range to some, definitely kind of just decide I'm going to get this bike right now. There were really nice kind of custom built, but also just stock bikes, nice custom paint jobs. But there were also some smaller brands presenting, which is always nice to see. Some older retro bikes and a lot more than just bikes as well. Some shoes and really worn shoes as well. Like, for example, Lachlan Morton shoes that he used to cycle around Australia were there. Did you smell them? I did not.
Oh, I thought you were going to say I did.
But I did not smell anything when I was standing near them, so they did not at least smell that bad.
Okay.
But it's always a great show to go to if you do want to also see, talking of, say, Lachlan Morton, like he was there himself. There were a lot of other pro cyclists having talks and just hanging about, really. Nearly got run over by Tom Pidcock while going for dinner on a city bike, and Rouleur Live it's always a great experience.
What was some of the standout products that you saw? What was the one bike that you kind of wish you could take home?
I think it probably might be the Trek Malone, the Pantone. I really like that one, the kind of pastel-y. If you want, because I'm not going to describe it because it's a lot of different colors hued together, but we do have a gallery up on escapedcollective.com, so you can go there and see the said bike. Gotcha. And a lot of the other cool looking bikes, but I think that was probably my favorite.
Cool. Before we move on, I mean, what were the general vibes? Like, one of the main reasons why you went to the show was to kind of chat to industry about larger pieces you're working on. What were general vibes, like optimism in the industry, or or dread for the next year ahead? How are people feeling?
I think generally it was a lot more optimistic than it was last year. It's not that all the doubts about or uncertainties about the next year have kind of faded away altogether, but it was definitely more optimistic vibe there from brands, and a lot of new stuff coming in 2025, which is always positive to hear, and in all different segments, not just one. So I'd say generally it was a positive vibe, and great to see also that just the number of people there. It's, I think, kind of indicative of how things are going.
Well, you heard it here first. Cycling as a sport will continue in 2025.
That's something to say.
That we can be sure of. Little else. While we're on the topic of Rouleur, we do have on the run sheet here a mention for the article I did looking into that Reap gravel bike, the Type 300. I covered that over the phone and have an in-depth article on the website about it. I also did a quick podcast with Ben Meir from Reap that's a members only, and so members will have got to listen to that, and Ben Meir sort of delved into more details behind how that bike came together. Suvi, you've actually seen it in person, though, I'm assuming, haven't been to Rouleur. What can you give us any idea what it's like? Or I'm just looking at photos, so it would be nice to hear what it's like in the raw carbon.
I mean, it is what it looks like in the pictures as well.
Why?
It's I think you get a really good idea of it in the pictures. Though, like, I think I probably got a less good of a view of it in the show actually in person, because it's extremely difficult to get. You have to really elbow people out of your way to get to certain bikes, and this Reap bike specifically was, I would say, probably the bike that everyone wants to have a look at.
That's kind of what I meant to ask you, was like, was the fuss that I was sensing about it real on the ground? It
was, definitely, yeah. Okay. Every time I walked past it, I was like, right, it's the moment to take pictures. There were about 20 people who were also thinking the same. So it was a very busy stand.
So, I mean, that Reap, like, it's a wide-tired gravel race bike, aero. They're playing with potentially new fibers in it, like biocomposite fibers. Ronan, you've got it all on the website. Go check out the article. The article's open for everyone to read. But the main thing for me that stood out with that bike was that they prototyped it from, like, not a single CAD design, like everything in their head, to like a rideable prototype in 7 weeks or 52 days. And that's kind of, for me, the big story. So I guess, like, yeah, like, just to stick on this for a second longer, is that, I mean, they're kind of claiming that them being a small manufacturer, all in-house manufacturing allows them to do this, and allows them to, like, take what's a very new emerging trend of wide tires in a gravel race bike and bring it to market before the trend moves on, basically. Do you think that we'll see other brands following suit in such rapid production? What's your take on this?
I mean, so I think that's, you know, it's a nice position to be in, that they could turn it around that quickly. I don't think the plan was to turn it around that quickly intentionally, but that is sort of what attracted me to it, and why I decided to do a bit of a deep dive on it. Is just like, when you compare that to the development cycles that you hear from the big manufacturers, yeah, you could be talking 7 months at a minimum with a big manufacturer, and they've done it in 7 weeks. And I just don't think that's ever going to be an option for the biggest brands who, you know, mass produce, work on a much bigger scale. You know, it just isn't. And so, you know, there's a few things about that bike. The fact they were able to turn it around so quickly means that it was one of the first bikes to market following the summer of gravel that just happened, where, you know, there was this huge jump in what people were demanding in terms of tire clearance. And then there's also the fact that they've used this biocomposite reinforced carbon. That was interesting. And then just the look of it was pretty interesting as well. And they're promising all this compliance. That's going to be interesting to track, because, you know, nobody has actually ridden the bike on gravel yet.
Yeah.
So it's all sort of theoretical.
It hasn't been physically tested either. It's just all.
It was ridden around a car park.
No, sure, but not like, it hasn't been, you know, run through ISO testing or anything like that. I mean, it's all just FEA and computer based at this point in time. So it's like, it's a theoretically possible bike.
I think what we might see is maybe more brands in a similar position to Reap who can do this quickly, who maybe wouldn't have previously, seeing the marketing opportunity in it. And we might see more of it for that reason. The flip side of it all is that Reap can take this experiment. Some people can try it next year. And if it turns out that actually, you know what, we don't need 50 mil of tyre clearance for a gravel race bike, then the other bigger brands can sort of bide their time and maybe not need to do that experiment themselves.
My counterpoint to all of this is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think most brands are probably capable of drawing up something and having a rideable prototype within a matter of weeks. But there is a reason why things then take many more months, because I think that time can be used valuably to ensure the design is as good as it can be for the end consumer. And I think Reap are doing that. Like, they're not ready to sell this thing. Like, it's probably worth stating this is a prototype. This is a prototype that still needs to go through testing and refinement. But I think brands taking months before they're willing to talk about something is something I'm still quite happy with. If those months are being used to get the product baked that little bit better.
That is one thing that I've definitely mentioned in the article, is that we're not exactly comparing apples for apples here. Big brands, when you hear about their new bikes, it's either because they've leaked them and they are ready to be sold, or they've officially launched them and they are in shops. Often they're in shops. And the other thing, just because you can doesn't mean you should, is just on that tire clearance. And it was an interesting conversation with Ben Muir, because he told us he gave us a bit of an insight into the pressure that does come from this tire trend. And he didn't necessarily believe that a 50 mil tire is right for all gravel racing, but it's one of those, like we've seen it with the Trek Checkpoint earlier this summer, that it doesn't have 50 mil clearance. I did actually get 50 mil tires onto that bike this week and rode it without issue, so it is capable of taking 50s. But Trek got a whole backlash for not having it.
Yep.
And as I said in the article as well, there's pros and cons. What you take in tire clearance, you lose in chainring clearance. And so it's not just more is better always. But definitely brands are clearly being pressured down that direction.
Yeah, it probably is a lesson for brands though, in that Trek probably spent 2 years bringing that to market, and when they finally did, for some consumers, it felt out of date already. And I think, perhaps there's a happier medium in between what Reap has done and what likes of Trek. And there's a brand releasing a new bike next week, which apparently spent 4 years in development. There's probably a happy medium here where they're going to try shorten these cycles to try keep up with the fast moving trends that perhaps weren't so prevalent before.
Is that a gravel bike that took 4 years in development?
No, but I won't. It's not for me to say anything more. Stay tuned. Anyway.
So this week on our minds, there's been a lot of things in addition to the Strava and Rouleur news. Dave, what has been a topic that you've been thinking about a lot?
It's been consuming my mind a little bit, which is that I don't think any product should be annoying to use. And this comes off the back of, I posted on Instagram a little reel comparing a SRAM Ultimate Piston Press versus the AliExpress copy of that tool. And the AliExpress copy of that tool looked the same, but then fell apart while you're using it. And someone responded to that saying, well, it's a tool I'll only use a few times a year, so I'm happy for it to being annoying to use when I need it. And I just think that's unacceptable of any product. I don't think we should encourage purchasing of any products or the existence of products that are annoying to own and use. And I just think life is short. Use good products. Don't give your money to things that are annoying. And so that's on my mind. I believe, Suvi, you might not agree with me on that.
I don't completely agree, because I think if it's a product that I use, say, once or twice a year, if it's a tool that I use very rarely, if it does the job, if it's slightly annoying to use, I'll still be happy with it.
Were you posting it on an alias on was this your comment on my Instagram page?
Maybe. Yeah, I think I'm happy to live with some sort of slight annoyment with if it's something I'm not using regularly. If it's something that I use on a daily basis, say, I don't know what I would pick. Heart rate monitor. Not necessarily
I thought you were going to say sports watches.
Not that, because I do that one. I would not tolerate it to be annoying. Yeah, but I mean, a watch is also a thing I do wear on a daily basis. I would not tolerate if it's annoying. I would just get something better and spend more money on it to get something I actually enjoy using. Same with heart rate monitors. I think I've recently been thinking about that. I've started to wear one, like an optical one on my arm. I've loved it because I hate the chest ones, really. Some of them, they're okay, but most of the time they annoy me. And I've got to the point. So this, with that, it's kind of true. On daily basis, something that is annoying. I can't tolerate it.
Okay. But for something you might only use once, twice a year, you're happy for it to be kind of rubbish?
Yeah. I wouldn't use rubbish if it's absolutely rubbish. If it breaks, I think that's the thing. If it still lasts like a number of years, that's acceptable.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, I think we should clarify the obvious here in that you don't want the product to be annoying, even if you only use it once or twice, but you would put up with it if you only use it once or twice a year, I think is the key difference here.
Definitely.
I think the question for me though is like, would you use it more often if it was less annoying? And that's, I think of that piston press I watched that reel, and the SRAM one is one I wanted for a long time. It costs a lot of money, so I haven't invested in it.
Yeah.
And so I'm using an inferior tool that's not annoying. And then the question for me is like, if I maybe don't have the correct tool, do I invest in the AliExpress one because I can't afford the SRAM one, or do I do without until I can afford the SRAM one?
Option C, which is a mini press, which I've also been playing with, and you'll see covered in threaded this week. Yeah.
And is it annoying?
It's not, no. And it's
then why would you ever get the SRAM one?
Because it predates the mini press that seems to do everything the SRAM one does. The SRAM one for SRAM calipers does create more efficient force and is wider, so you can press in mountain bike caliper with multiple pistons. You can press in more pistons at the same time. But yeah, there's not a lot of reason to get it given how much it costs. But yeah, it's not about a piston press at this point. It's about a larger
it's a principle.
thing. Yeah,
we're all just using the piston press example.
How often do you use a piston press?
I mean, if you're in a bike shop daily, multiple times a day. If you're a consumer, it's probably only going to be when you're changing your brake pads. So, I mean, it's not going to be that frequent as a regular consumer. So yeah, for the person that said I'm only going to use this once or twice a year and I'm happy for it to be a little bit annoying, fair. But I mean, that little bit of annoyance is literally the tool dropping into two pieces while you're trying to use it. So, I mean, for me, that's unacceptable, but each to their own.
Dave, I would also argue that the home user probably should be using a piston press more often than they are, because there's some advantage to cleaning and resetting and therefore lubricating the pistons and freeing them up so that they move more smoothly.
That's true.
We do talk about sticky pistons on a semi-regular basis on this podcast, and using that tool and not having it collapse into a heap in your hand when you're trying to use it is, I think, in everyone's interest for many reasons.
Yep. But yeah, I didn't want this to be about piston pressing and caliper pistons, but it is inevitably. But yeah, I think it's a prime example.
I haven't placed my vote if I'm on Dave's side or Suvi's side.
Yeah, but
I ordered my SRAM piston press this week, so nice. I've cast my vote.
Okay.
I'm falling on Dave's side here as well, in that I just do not have the patience for crap things.
Yeah. So I mean, this,
but you know what's worse is when you have an expensive thing that also doesn't work well and is cumbersome. So that's the real worst thing.
Yeah. No, I'm very much on Ronan's point, which is if it's not annoying to use, you're more likely to use it, and if it is annoying to use, you probably won't use it again, and therefore you've wasted your money. So yeah, I think that's, for me, I think, there's good design that should be intuitive to use and enjoyable to use, and then there's bad design or sloppy, crummy manufacturing that leads to a product that just doesn't quite do what it claims to do. And yeah, I think that's the main takeaway for me, is like, I guess my job as a tech editor is to promote the stuff that isn't annoying to use, that's enjoyable to use, and that does its job reliably and for a long time. And I'm not going to be afraid to tell people not to buy the cheaper thing if it is inferior.
I want to ask Brad what he's been doing before he had the SRAM version.
I'm guessing a Pedro's tire lever.
Sometimes the end of a box end wrench can work well if you're careful. Not for the faint of heart. And sometimes if you are resetting pistons and the brake pads themselves are worn, you can kind of use a large flat blade in there, whether it's a tire lever or a screwdriver, and kind of walk the pads back and use the pads themselves as a little bit of a press,
and push those dirty pistons back in.
But again, it's not always. It depends on the circumstances. I'm not one way all the time kind of guy. So it depends on the situation and the caliper shape and kind of there's a few variables there. But I've been toying with the idea of investing in the piston press for a while, and it's time anyway. And every time I do it the so-called wrong way. I mean, there was not so long ago, there was no piston press, so there had to be a different way. And that was where my techniques were forged. But now that there is, I've decided to get with the trend and follow Dave's lead.
So again, threaded this week, I do cover what I think might be the best version of this. And it's also not at all the most expensive. It's probably the cheapest option. But with all that said, with all these tools that I have, with all these dedicated piston presses that I have, I still find it most efficient to typically use a plastic tire lever to push pistons back in. That said, I'm pretty experienced at doing that. I know what it feels like for a piston to be going back in straight and smoothly. And I would say most consumers could benefit from a dedicated tool that would completely save them from accidentally putting a piston in crooked and breaking the piston and ruining their caliper and then requiring a whole new caliper and a bleed and all the above. Because it can happen, especially on Shimano. It's very easy to crack a piston on those. So yeah, the dedicated tools do make it easier in that sense. So choose your own adventure.
Dave, every time you talk about tools, I find myself thinking like I can position myself in your workshop wondering.
No, you can't.
Like you've got a job to do. You have to push these pistons back in. You open a drawer and there's a million options.
There's only
Come to my workshop.
Yeah, there's 6 options.
That has to be the lowest count you have for a tool for a specific job.
Yeah. So no, I mean my workshop. I mean this is going way off track now, but I do have like a tool wall of my preferred tools that I reach for out of instinct. But if I am specifically testing new tools or comparing to see, battling them to see whether one shines above the other, because there can only be one true winner, then I will, I'll basically do like dedicated testing of them. And then if they are bad or I find them annoying or they're not as good as what I previously used, then they do go into a drawer of doom.
Annoying products, that's what it's labeled.
Yes. But there are also tool categories where like I might keep 2 or 3 of the same thing for various different things. So like the SRAM piston press is still my favorite for like really, really stuck and almost like rusty kind of like SRAM pistons that can be very stubborn to move. That new little mini press that I'm covering in threaded is sort of the go-to when I just want to be sure that I'm putting delicate pistons back straight, and then everything else is kind of like Pedro's tire lever for efficiency. So yeah, it's all in my head. Not much else is, but that is.
Nice, yeah, a lot.
Yeah, so anyway, I've said threaded like 6 times now, but threaded is a newsletter that I do every fortnight for home mechanics, for professional mechanics, for enthusiasts of tools, and it's if you like tools, if you like working on bikes, it is almost definitely certainly for you. So head to Escape Collective, check it out.
Well, I'll stand in the minority with this thought then and keep using my tire levers. And I'll just have friends like Dave who have the correct tools. That's the way to do it. We will move on to our quick tech bites, which could be also titled Quick Tech Bikes this week, I feel. Because there's a lot of new bikes. There are a lot of new bikes.
There are.
Okay, so there's a lot of new bikes. Dave's gonna talk us through Mondraker Arid, a new gravel bike. Looks quite an interesting one, this one.
Yeah, so Mondraker, they previously had a gravel bike. Their first gravel bike was an e-bike. This is now their first gravel bike that is, as Alex Hunt, our new tech writer, said, naturally aspirated. So the Mondraker Arid Carbon, and it's kind of like similar to like the Santa Cruz Stigmata, BMC Urs, YT Scepter, in that it's like quite a off-roady kind of mountain bike inspired bike. It's got like a really long front center with a short stem. But Mondraker are claiming it to be the gravel bike for everyone, which is bold. And it does look quite cool. It's got some pretty unique, interesting design language in it, which you can see if you go to Escape Collective. But yeah, it's got some bit of Pinarello-esque design to it. Mondraker themselves have some unique design in their bikes, so certainly not boring. But yeah, there's a lot going on with this bike, including like storage hatch, room for 50mm tires. It's got all like your Brad. It's got a UDH. Brad just woke up, so.
It's also got really wide handlebars, which I don't know if it's just a mountain bike thing, because I think the smallest frame size has 44 bars.
Yeah. So yeah, that's correct.
Which is wide.
Yeah, and then the biggest ones have 46s. So yeah, I mean they're definitely trying to add some mountain bike flair to this bike. I don't really agree with the handlebar width of things, but each their own. And yeah, it's a bike that I believe Alex is going to get in for a review pretty soon. So yeah, stay tuned on that one.
Ronan, do you want to add something?
I was just going to say that the wide handlebars like that, I do think we have to remember we're coming from a sort of a road background, most of us. If you're coming to gravel from mountain bike, as is increasingly happening, wide set of handlebars like that is probably going to make and from a brand like Mondraker, it's just it's more welcoming to you, I think, as a mountain biker versus us as roadies.
It is the stability of a wider bar is more feels like home to some mountain bikers. I would say that there's probably some ergonomic gains to be had by not going so wide, but for some people, and certainly aerodynamic gains. But yeah, it does make sense for a mountain bike brand making a fully versatile bike like this to spec a slightly wider handlebar for what is arguably going to be their mountain bike customers trying it. So, but yeah, anyway, we'll cover that bike again in more detail in the future.
We will. Next new bike is from Argonaut. This is Argonaut.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you say it?
Argonaut, yeah.
Supernaut.
Mm-hmm. Supernaut.
Supernaut, okay.
Supernaut.
Why is it Argonaut? It's not Supernaut.
I'm just confusing you.
How is that?
Yeah, so Argonaut, Supernaut, this is their flagship bike. They released it, I believe, last year as a limited edition thing, and now it's now going to be a continuing thing in their lineup. So it's they've got production slots available up to 30 bikes a year for this, and yeah, it's basically like Argonaut. They're based in Bend, Oregon. They make really high-end, beautiful carbon bikes in-house. They just do one gravel bike, one road bike. And this is kind of like their S-Works competitor in a sense. So it's like ultra premium layup, price no issue, and it's like the lightest, stiffest, most highest performing bike they can produce. So yeah, if you're a S-Works kind of customer, then this is the sort of bike to check out. It's pretty special. I've seen one last year at Made, and yeah, it's pretty. It's very light, so not much more to add to that. But yeah, USA made carbon fiber racing frame.
And then we have a steel bike from Colnago.
From Colnago. Sorry.
Pronunciation is not my strong suit here. How did this one go then?
I laugh because I've always struggled with Argonaut as well. It's like, yeah. Anyway, Colnago 70 today. Happy birthday, Colnago. They've got a super premium, super limited, very steel new bike to celebrate. There's only 70 of them. They're called the Steelnovo. It's got Columbus tubing, and it sticks with like a lug and tube sort of construction, but the lugs are 3D printed, which is sort of, well, it's not new for Colnago, but it's certainly new in their steel range. They've still got the Master in that, but it doesn't feature anything like that. And on top of that, it's much more modern than something like the Master in that it's got 35mm tire clearance, disc brakes, only electronic group sets. It actually comes with a sort of custom version of Campagnolo's Super Record wireless with Italian flags and gold details on it.
Tell us the price.
Costs 17,500 euros, which is a lot of money.
It's a steal.
It's you beat me to it. It's not a steal. I mean, like, it's not that long ago Colnago announced that rim brake C68. So when I first seen this come into my inbox earlier this week, I thought, oh, they've now announced a new steel bike, or steel frame. The carbon forks in this, I should say, they're not steel forks. Well, that was before I realized it was 17.5 grand, and it's also very, very limited. Although they have said the initial run, which
Yeah, they might put it
sounds to me like
into
it might-
production as a non-anniversary bike afterwards.
possibly some different version of it or something, maybe less flashy.
For me, aesthetically, I mean, Colnago is a modern brand that is free to innovate as they want, but it doesn't aesthetically look like a steel Colnago in a sense. It looks more like a to take it back to the roots of who did the 3D printed lugs first in such a way. I'm going to say it looks more like a Prova in that sense, like the seat tube junction.
Is
the
that
lug there.
the
Yeah.
yes, yeah, the seat tube clamp area? Yeah, I can see where you're seeing that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it looks nice. Not a bike I'll be riding anytime soon, but it does look like a nice steel bike, and they've obviously taken a lot of manual effort to remove the weld joints, like to smooth the welds. So yeah, it does kind of look like a carbon bike made out of steel in a sense, which is odd. But yeah,
I have requested a bit of a sit down virtually with some folks from Colnago, because I was just interested in, like, first of all, a rim brake, then a steel frame. Okay, the steel one's the limited edition. Who knows what's going to hold in the future there? But I wanted to chat to them and see if there's anything, a few more questions that may or may not happen, but it's something that I have requested.
Yep. And worth reiterating, this new Steelnovo is disc brake only, wireless shifting only. Yeah, so it's very modern.
And all made in Italy.
That's actually, Suvi, you've had a good point there. That's one of the big things about it, is like the made in Italy was one of the terms floating about somewhere. I'm going to say from Italian brands and Italian manufacturers, because not all the parts are made in Italy. But one of the key themes here is that everything was from this fairly relatively small area in northern Italy. And I do know, having spoke to a couple of different Italians recently about their own personal bikes at home, this is a big thing. For Italians, they're very proud of that heritage there, as they should be. And it is a thing to, like, go out and try and build an Italian only bike. And now that I think about it, I've actually done it myself in the past with my Pinarello F8. I think everything bar the speed plate pedals, at one point, everything bar the speed plate pedals was Italian. So, yeah.
That is good going. And speaking of Italians, the last bike on our list is an Italian bike as well. Pinarello F1, a Formula 1 bike. I don't know if there was actually thinking behind this. Anyway, Pinarello's cheapest bike in the F series.
Long drop there for me, sorry.
Sorry, yeah. So this is the cheapest bike in Pinarello's F series. So this is going to retail less than $4,000. It does come though with mechanical 105 group set, cheaper, not say cheaper, lower grade carbon fiber T600 instead of T900, I believe was in the other models, and also with wheels that currently retail for about £100. So it's if you desperately want a Pinarello, this might be a bike that you can afford from Pinarello.
It's not the first time they've done such entry-level bikes. I'd say it's the first time in a while that we've seen them, but they certainly used to exist. I'm going to be really unfair to Pinarello here because I actually haven't ridden one of these, and so I probably shouldn't be sharing this opinion yet. But if you're looking at this bike at this price point, you typically will get a better riding bike from brands such as Specialized and Giant, in my experience, based on having ridden older generation Pinarellos aimed at this price point.
Yeah, I always wish that brands like Pinarello didn't even mess around with this sort of segment of the market. I feel like it's not their legacy, it's not their specialty,
Kind of
it's not their
hurts
bread
them.
and butter, and
Yeah.
you're not getting the value that you would get with the same money spent elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you there, Dave, for sure.
Yeah.
Campy also made some really peculiar Jeep groups back in the day. They probably still do. Groups I never have seen in real life, that are like very low end.
Yeah, they were playing in
Very-
the entry OE market for
Yeah.
a while, but yeah.
And I mean, they struggle enough at the high end these days. So to imagine, anybody opting for one of their low end groups compared to, say, like a 105 group like this bike has, that group is actually good. The 105 mechanical group is like very solid, but it doesn't really belong on a Pinarello either.
Campbike do still offer Centaur, is now the entry level camp bag. I know this because I looked it up this week when I was remembering all the Veloces and the Mirages and the Xenons and the Athenas and the Potenza group sets that we had of old.
Your Xenons and your Potenzas were the ones that I have heard of but never seen in real life, even though they technically exist.
No, you must have seen a Potenza. That's not that. Potenza's within the last 10 years, and that was fairly
Potenza was aimed
popular.
against 105 from memory, wasn't it? Or was it Ultegra mechanical? I can't even remember.
I think they aimed it at Ultegra, but I mean the same way as they aim chorus at Dura-Ace and Super Record, it just gets lost. But the reason I know this, or the reason I looked this up this week, is because I did have an article on the website that apparently Campagnolo are re-entering the World Tour with Cofidis. I say apparently, but we
unconfirmed
pretty
rumors.
much nailed on. Unconfirmed, confirmed to us, not by Campagnolo, but unconfirmed by Campagnolo. Which I mean, I think most people agree is a positive step to see that happening. But yeah, I remember I had Mirage on a Trek 1000 frame one time. That was an interesting winter bike.
Last one in quick tech bites, not a bike. Yeah, DT Swiss Dynamo hubs. Ronan, you know more about these.
Yes, DT Swiss partnered with Shutter Precision, SP Dynamo, to create their first Dynamo-equipped hub. Listeners to Geek Warning will know that I have extreme difficulty in getting DT Swiss products straight in my head and getting all the names right, and that I may or may not have spent an entire segment talking about a launch that happened months earlier. So I'm going to try not to mix this up. Basically what we're talking about is...
Listeners of the podcast don't know about that because we deleted that entire section from existence.
Oh, no, but I admitted to it then. The following week.
Right.
So they do know about it.
where you and James spent 20 minutes talking about a wheel set to then discover at the end of the 20-minute conversation that both of you were talking about two different wheel sets, which is why neither of you could get straight on the facts.
That was an interesting.
That should be the bonus episode for subscribers.
It was amazing. But like when the penny dropped, and you're like, "Hang on, I'm talking about a gravel wheel. No, I'm talking about a road wheel." But anyway, all right, sorry, go on. Dynamo wheel.
It is the 350 SP PL-7 Dynamo hub from DT Swiss. Long story short, it's DT Swiss's Dynamo for powering lights and that. It's going to be available in two wheel sets, the GR1600 spline dyne and the G1800. They both have 25mm deep rims, 24 internals. The 1600 is priced at like €320, $440. The G1800 is €250 or $340. Or you can buy the hub on its own at €175 or $240. I think the key thing here is that they claim, as is sort of has, it's not really new news, but you turn the light off for these things and the hub will only add an extra 1 watt of drag into your system. If you turn it on, that does jump up to 7. But yeah, you can power lights off this, USB converters, other devices, whatever.
Yeah. For me, the key thing with this is it just shows how big that market has become. The Dynamo market is that if a brand like DT Swiss is offering a stock product for it, I mean, the bikepacking and commuter market using this is significant for a company the size of DT Swiss to start wanting to be in it.
Yeah, bikepacking is taking off. There was a lot of mention of, I mean, it makes sense, I know DT Swiss geographical location and all that, but the German STVZO regulations, which are quite stringent on bicycle lights and that, and they even on dynamos, even though there's no light lamp in this system, the dynamo itself has to be capable of powering a lamp sufficiently to pass the STVZO German regulations. And I just kept thinking, is that something to do with like transcontinental or something like that? Is that maybe where DT see this? I mean, there's those events are getting very, very big. I don't know if there's a lot of them in Germany or not, but that was just something that entered my mind. And definitely, DT have said bikepacking, commuting, and then I don't think they specifically said gravel, but they said like this is cleared for off-road use and stuff, which I mean is gravel. So
yeah, cool.
And it's on a gravel wheel set, so
yep, nice,
great to see. And that's a good one to wrap up our tech news bites. And we're going to have a little break and then we're going to get to Ask a Wrench questions. So this week, our first question is from John Cowley from Somerset in the UK.
I have GRX brakes on my gravel bike and H11 Campag on my road bike. Now, I can't get the Shimano stuff to feel anything like the Campag. 2 questions. Do I have just to accept that, it's a cheaper product and it's never going to be as nice as what Magura did for Campag? And secondly, these GRX brakes need regular bleeding. Where does the air come from that I have to keep pumping out? And is there a way to prevent this happening, this degradation? I don't know if it's an issue that is happening because I tend to hang the bike from the front wheel on the garage wall, or just is that a red herring? Anyway, any guidance you could give would be greatly appreciated.
All right, Brad. So yeah, I mean, there's a few different questions here. It's like Campagnolo versus Shimano brake feel. But then also it sounds like maybe something related to proper bleed procedure for Shimano, which is known to be fussy. First part of the question, thoughts on Campag versus Shimano brake feel?
Well, so to jump right into, I guess, phase 1 or part 1 of the question, certainly in my experience with GRX, or at least a properly functioning GRX system, it should feel consistent and solid. I would sort of hazard to go as far as to say that Shimano has probably the best lever feel among the 3 major brands, although that's definitely
debatable. Yep.
Debatable.
Yep.
The new SRAM ones actually feel incredibly good too, yes. I must say. But historically speaking, Shimano's have been kind of the best for the longest. I think is maybe more in line with where my thought process was there. The new SRAM ones are fantastic. Campies are good too, but I don't think that you should be seeing Shimano ones suffering in the way that it sounds like you are, where your Campy ones are consistently better and your Shimano ones are constantly requiring some maintenance, or perhaps the maintenance that's being done to them is not being done correctly, is my other speculation. And one thing that I would ask kind of for a little bit more information first, like whether or not you have like a soft contact, or whether you have the feeling that the stroke of the lever, like the throw of the lever, is growing, but when it does finally hit it, it's solid. That would lead me to kind of 2 different maybe recommended approaches to fix the problem. But one goes back to our piston press, Dave, and something we were kind of talking about earlier, since it's on my mind after your discussion. Even though we weren't supposed to discuss it, we discussed it a lot, and I'm going to discuss it some more. If you have sticky pistons that are sluggish to retract back into the caliper once you've squeezed them, that can lead to the symptom of having, ultimately solid contact point, but perhaps a vague bite point, or a wandering bite point, or a bite point that seems like you have to squeeze the lever farther. Sometimes versus other times. And that can be because the pistons themselves aren't retracting fully in the first place. So that's one. If you've never cleaned your pistons and reset them, which is the point of the tool that we discussed at such length, that would be a great starting point. And I think it's something that's overlooked, especially by people who do a lot of maintenance on their own bikes at home. They may not realize how significant that can be if it's neglected. And so I would start with that and see if that gets you any closer to a good feeling before you go back through bleeding it again. What do you think, Dave?
I just wanted to add a favorite tool related to that, which is what they call an exposure bleed block, which is basically a cutaway bleed block that lets you safely push out the piston to its maximum distance out without chance of leaking, lets you clean it and then push it back in. So yeah, Chris Hirschap, who's a member of the Escape Collective, he runs a little 3D printing business, and he sells these on Etsy, which is like a really nice little product. So not a lot of money, worth looking at if you're wanting to do what Brad's talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you don't want to sort of squeeze your pistons all the way to their fully extended and beyond kind of position, because you can't actually push the pistons basically completely out of the caliper and then dump all the fluid from the system onto your shoes, which is typically what happens to anyone who does this, including me in the past. It's definitely happened before. So yeah, it's always nice to use something, whether it's a specific product or at least mindfulness, and maybe like something homemade like a tire lever can often function in that way too. Just something that you can't squeeze the pistons completely together when the pads are removed, because that's usually a bit too far. But yeah, the other question I would have too is if you're having to bleed them frequently, is if they were bled correctly in the first place. And yet, like Dave said, there's a bit of a process that Shimano kind of outlines, some of it's a bit feeling based as well. In my experience, it can involve turning the bar, bike at various angles, different things to help the travel. I will often remove the calipers, especially the rear one, because the path of the hose is not usually, well, first of all, it's definitely not vertical. It may actually kind of go down before it goes up, let's say, if the bike's level to the ground. So you may want to point the front end of the bike up and explore ways where you can kind of allow that, trapped air to flow as freely upwards as possible. So that's another suggestion if you're struggling to get the bleed right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, brake bleeding is just a practice of gravity, and quite a lot of brakes in Shimano road/gravel brakes especially have a lot of kinks and curves in them that don't allow like the air pockets to sit at the highest point, or at least not naturally. So you kind of have to move things around to help. The other option is, and this is something that there's a full member created protocol for this in the Escape Collective Discord that has been shared with like a full PDF about it, but is a much more involved bleed process, which involves using syringes. So you sort of almost customize a bleed kit to be syringes, and therefore you're able to pull like a vacuum on the brake system. Care is needed because the Shimano brake system is kind of delicate from this sense. It is possible to damage bladders and stuff by doing this, but yeah, that's sort of one way around this sort of common issue is that air does hide in these systems, and there are mechanics typically have their chosen ways or preferred ways to get these air pockets out of the system.
Yeah, Dave, you did just jump on a little bit there, the last of my three thoughts, which is that if you have kind of an inconsistent brake that feels like it's getting worse as you use it once you've bled it, there is a chance, and because it's Shimano, there's a strong chance that you may have upset the bladder and the lever potentially, or some element of the caliper as well, but it's most likely in the lever that I've seen. Like if you pump the system full of pressure, or if you pull too hard, if you're doing like a vacuum bleed with a syringe on the caliper, you can kind of unseat the bladder itself, and then you might see fluid kind of dumping out of the body of the lever somewhere. If you see like fluid if you roll your hood back and see some moisture there, that's not sweat, and it's cleaned, and then you can still see kind of moisture purging, that is a sign that you may have something amiss with your the bladder or the lever internals themselves. So that's one definite scenario where you can see Shimano brakes not feeling very good, and that's why. But if everything is like intact and as it should be, once you have it bled correctly, it should feel as good or better than your Campy brakes do, and shouldn't require much more than a yearly kind of fluid flush, and that's about the maintenance you'll need to do.
Yeah, but yeah, even perfectly set up, they do have a different brake feel between Campy and Shimano. Yes. I find Campy brakes tend to be a little bit softer feeling at the lever, which helps with modulation, but yeah, it's very personal. But yeah, just the fact that you say like hanging the bike upside down causes problems, it sounds like it's probably the middle problem, which is air is still in the system.
Air in there. So. Yes. Yeah, so try to bleed it more vertically to really help that air work its way to the top of the system and out into like the bleed cup at the levers, and that may require some creativity on your part. There's a good tool I use actually that I like is Feedback Sports makes it's like, I think they call it the flop stop. It's a tool that basically keeps your handlebar from wiggling around freely. And if you need to point the bike upwards, it keeps the bar from wanting to like flop to one side or the other, which if you have a bleed cup attached to your lever can create all sorts of messes and surprises. So it's good to kind of keep the handlebar steady while you do some of this creative maneuvering of the bike to position it in ways that allows the air to travel out.
Yeah, Park Tool do one as well.
Yeah.
These brake bleed issues that you were describing, many of them sound exactly like what I was experiencing a few months ago. The reservoir leaking fluid.
Yeah, that's a little more involved and a bit of a rebuilding and sometimes exploratory.
But I enjoyed it.
Yeah. It can be resolved usually without even, depends on the extent of things, but oftentimes it just comes unseated within, and you need to just kind of put things back in place, and it can usually be salvaged. So.
And yeah, great learning curve.
Yes.
Our second question and last question for this week is from Jeff in Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA.
I'm not sure this is exactly an Ask a Mechanic question. It's more an Ask an Expert question. Good thing you're all such great experts. This is following on your conversation about handlebars and particularly the compliance aspect of them. For a gravel bike, what's the right way to think about compliance offered by the frame, seat post, bars, and other components? Let's assume 40 millimeter tires at 40 psi. How much will the average rider notice a compliance difference beyond what's offered by the tires themselves?
Yes, this is a question about compliance and how relevant are some of the modern advances in products other than tires to facilitate improvements in the compliance department. This is, a talking point or a selling point for just about every modern bike that comes out. They want to discuss their compliance and engineered flex and all these things. And for sure, tires and pressure is a critical kind of first step for setting up your bike and establishing the way that it feels and that it feels the way you kind of want it to. But there's a lot of things that have come along and products that have come along and materials that have advanced over the last, many, many years, decades, that have actually approached kind of the same, or at least in the same kind of neighborhood of compliance gains that you can get from tires. So I discussed this with Greg, my partner in crime at our bike shop in Washington, D.C., who actually had some pretty interesting specifics about this. And he named Damon Renard, who's a former engineer at Cannondale, before that Cervelo, before that, I believe Trek as well. So he's been around a lot of the major brands that kind of pushed this envelope throughout the last 10 or 15, 20 years or so. And according to him, in the early 2000s, compliance available from your tires, he says was roughly, he said one order of magnitude, which is about 10 times more than any other, variable. So frame, wheels, etc. But since about the mid-teens, 2000 teens, frame, wheels, things like that have basically kind of entered into the same order of magnitude. So in other words, within kind of percentage differences, not like multiple times over differences. All that is to say, it's actually almost as important as your tires is kind of the short way of putting that. It can be, depending on obviously what you're using or not. But the opportunity to facilitate those types of gains do exist now. So and they would be, assuming you notice your tire pressure as well, it would be just as noticeable as that. So to answer your question, it would be equivalently noticeable, definitely something you would notice. I mean, I remember the first time I put carbon wheels on my bike, what a revelation that was. And I'd been riding for, 15 years at that point and couldn't believe the difference that I could feel there. And so, seat posts, sometimes the length of the amount of exposed seat post you have may dictate how much of a feeling you get from that. But even a short carbon post versus like an aluminum post of the same specs, you would absolutely feel something. But handlebars now, saddles, even some stems have some stuff that they've claimed to engineer into them for improved ride feel. Carbon wheels are certainly an area where you'll feel a big difference if you don't have them already. But not just tires anymore. So you can kind of believe some of the hype, at least, if not all of it, in that conversation. But there's definitely a lot of high-paid engineers who are spending a lot of time thinking about these things, and the benefits are real.
I would argue like the carbon wheel statement, it's more like, frame material. Like it doesn't have to be a carbon frame in order to be smooth. It's how, the design of the frame that matters more than the material. I would say you could get an aluminium wheel that improves your comfort, and you can get carbon wheels that degrade it. But there are some very smooth riding carbon wheels out there. But I'd say for me, how I look at it is like the tire is a spring, and you can have other springs on top of that. Like the tire is your first spring that contacts the ground, and then there is still vibration that makes it past that tire. So the frame, the seat post, the handlebar, they can be additional springs to the equation that then continue to soak and absorb and dampen the further vibrations and impacts. So certainly like the way I look at it is on a mountain bike, I own, say, one of my bikes has 140 millimeters of suspension travel on the front, 120 millimeters in the rear. It has big 29 by 2.4 inch tires. That's a lot of springs. You'd think between the tires and the suspension, you'd have plentiful comfort. But then I can still feel the difference between, say, a rigid aluminium bar and a flexible carbon bar. I can feel the difference between a stiff carbon bar and a flexible carbon bar. Like I changed out one carbon bar for another because I was getting hand discomfort, and moving to like a one-up composites bar, which has intentional flex in it, that actually removed some of the hand discomfort that I was getting, and sort of prolonged the amount of descending I could do before that discomfort set in. So yeah, this is something that does exist. Some people will be, I'd say some people have better perception to it. I'm absolutely hypersensitive to this stuff. It's my job, but yeah, I think, you know, to Brad's point, like if you had this gravel bike, it's got 40 mil tires running 40 psi, and you had like this stiff aluminium seat post on your bike, and you moved to a known flexible carbon seat post, you would feel the difference. I think everyone would feel the difference. You'd probably get quickly accustomed to that difference, but on the first ride, you would feel it. Ronan?
2 quick points from me. I think, or the only thing I'm hearing at the moment in conversations I'm having with countless manufacturers is that the years to come, we're going to see huge gains again in terms of compliance, and looking at some of the materials that they're looking to integrate in that, and that's coming from wheel manufacturers, frame manufacturers. Yeah, but that'll be the only 2, won't it? I guess it could then add into saddles and bars and that. The other thing I think is just an opposite way to look at it is like you can get compliance above the tires, but again, the tires are the starting point, and if you get your tire pressure so badly wrong, nothing above that can. If your tires are just like way too hard, and you just, you know, nothing above that is going to save it. But if your tire pressures are right, you can then still feel the compliance from components within the frame. And the most notable for me recently has been again that Trek checkpoint, and the seat post on that. So much so that I'm convinced that the saddle angle I have set, I've had to go further nose down on the saddle because I'm certain I'm getting that much compliance that
there's that much flex in the system.
The nose is, yeah. But I mean, it's like there's one particularly rough section of gravel just right by my home that if I do a gravel route, I'll either go out that road or come back it. And like across that on the Trek checkpoint, it's like, it was one of the first things I noticed about that bike.
Mm-hmm.
In a positive way.
Yes. So Jeff, there you go. Like, especially for gravel, I think compliance is like absolutely the new frontier, the current frontier in terms of bike design. Like, I think it, in many ways, at least in my opinion, it's more important than a few 100 grams here or there, and it's certainly more important than stiffness for power transfer. Like, I think we're quickly getting to a point where people are realizing that just doesn't matter that much. But yeah, compliance is something that will improve your comfort and speed on a bike when you're talking off-road situations. That's where that stretch of gravel that I mentioned there, it's like I always hammer it through there. It's like an interval coming through there. And on the stiffest, harshest, most brilliant bikes for power transfer, I'm slower because I can't transfer the power. I'm getting bounced about that much versus something with more compliance. Which, I mean, could get us down the whole suspension conversation route. Let's not go there today.
Cool. Yeah, interesting point. I think going back to what Ronan was saying about materials as well, the Reap bike, again, going to what we've talked about before, it's quite interesting what is happening, especially in the carbon fiber field of using different materials, different types of fibers, different types of composites, not just carbon fiber, but kind of flex and all sorts of things that have different properties and different flex and whatever the actual engineering terms are. Yeah. And it's just like, it's a maturing of the consumer to not just want to purchase the thing that is stiffer and lighter. Okay, so I'm sure there are still many consumers that still want that, and I'd say probably the majority is still thinking that, but I think it's starting to change where people are starting to understand that stiffer and lighter is not necessarily better. And I think, gravel is arguably the first drop bar segment that we're seeing that really come to the front, and brands are now able to design around what is actually going to make a better bike. So I'm all for it. And here's also what Jeff says about average rider. I would say one last thing that, like Dave, when you were talking about you're very sensitive, it also comes from when you get to test different things, especially back to back. You are starting to notice smaller differences between different things. Whereas if you just ride one bike for 5 years and then you jump onto another one, you quickly adapt to that bike and you think that's the new norm and the perfect. You might notice a difference in the beginning, but then it all becomes the same kind of thing. But if you keep changing a lot, I feel you become a little bit more sensitive to those differences, which is maybe something to keep in mind and actually try. If you have the possibility to try a new handlebar, are you going to notice that difference or not?
For sure.
And not buy a new frame every time. Definitely not. Don't do that.
Yep. And obviously it also depends on what your baseline is, right? Like you might actually have a ready semi-flexible handlebar, and swapping to a known comfortable handlebar might not give you that much of a difference. But if your bike does have like a quite cheap aluminium handlebar, like a straight gauge aluminium handlebar, then there probably is benefits to be had, gains to be had. So yeah, your results may vary depending on where you are sitting currently.
Exactly. Well, that's a wrap for our Ask the Wrench questions this week. If you want to submit yours, there you have to be an Escape Collective member, and then you just head over to escapecollective.com/hello, and you introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and ask a question. It's as simple as that. I think that's all the tech and all the news and everything that was in our minds on this fine day covered.
Suvi, before we go, can I just let listeners know that Performance Process was out last week? We had a great episode with Xavier Disley of Aero Coach, give us a whole lot of tips on going faster with no extra effort. But also just to let listeners know, there is now a mailbag, what you just referenced there, hello section of the website for members. You can now ask questions to the Performance Process podcast.
I will back Ronan on that. It was a fantastic episode. It was a great episode, Ronan. Yeah, I think it, most importantly, it was a great episode if you are not up to speed on aero. And yeah, if you're kind of a bit foreign to it, you don't really think it matters or where to begin, I think that is the episode to begin with. I think it's one of the best introductory explainers to the aero world I've heard or seen. So well done on that one.
Thank you. I'll pass your kind words on to Xavier also.
And then yeah, for me, just to plug, I've got I mentioned earlier, Threaded New Tools Day. It's a gallery of all fancy new tools and what I think of them. That is going to be on the site the same day that this episode drops. And then just a reminder that all of our staff of Escape Collective, or just about all of the staff, we're currently going through our favorite products of the year, one by one. So mine have been published. Ian Trelaw's been published. Suvi, yours are up. And you'll see them continue to roll out every few days. So definitely head to Escape Collective and catch up on the ones you've missed, and look out for the ones you haven't.
I was writing mine today. I had to look up how to spell Chris Hirschap.
Interesting.
So that's
something 3D printed in yours then. Okay.
Yes.
I actually can guess what it is, but I won't ruin the surprise.
I'm sure you can.
But yeah, anyway.
That's enough from us this week. Thank you so much for listening, and do send us all of your comments and feedback through whatever channel you want to, and we'll be back next week with loads more tech stuff.
I'll just give a very quick request that if you have a friend that likes podcasts, they like cycling, and maybe they like tech, send this to them. Maybe not this. Send them an episode you like, whatever episode you like. If it's this one, send it to them. But
or all of them.
Or send them all of them, one by one. So thank you.
Like an advent calendar for the next 25 days.
It's an excellent idea, Roland.